My name is Gloria Marsh, and I was 63 years old when my son-in-law stood up at my daughter's wedding reception, raised his champagne glass, looked directly at me across the room, and called me a pig in front of 200 people. The hall went completely silent. Not the comfortable kind of silence that settles between songs. The sharp, airless kind that happens when something ugly lands in a beautiful room. A few guests laughed nervously, looking at their plates. My daughter Penny sat frozen beside him at the head table, her eyes dropping to her napkin. Then he added one more line, smiling at the room like he had just said something clever. And no offense to anyone, but the apple usually doesn't fall far from the tree. Nobody laughed at that one. Someone at the far end of the head table was holding up a phone, recording everything. And I simply sat still, folded my hands in my lap, and watched him. Because what he did not know that night was going to matter enormously very soon. The room filled back up with noise quickly, the forced busy kind that people manufacture when they need to pretend something didn't happen. Glasses clinked. Chairs scraped. The band started playing before anyone asked them to. I stayed in my seat and breathed slowly. Later, when the dancing started, I gently touched Penny's arm and guided her toward a quiet corner near the entrance. She came willingly, but her eyes were already apologizing before she opened her mouth. "Mom, please don't make this into something. You know how he is. It's just his humor." Humor. That word sat in my chest like a stone. I looked at my daughter, her beautiful dress, her carefully done hair, the tension sitting just behind her eyes, and I said nothing more. But as I walked back to my table, I noticed something. The groom's parents, seated near the front, had not laughed once. His mother was pressing her fingers against her lips. His father was staring at the tablecloth. Neither of them looked like people who had just heard a harmless joke. I spent the next hour watching rather than talking. My son-in-law's name was Brandon Hale. He was 36, worked as a senior director at his father's financial firm, and moved through rooms the way people do when they have never once been told no about anything that mattered. With the investors at table 4, he was all warmth and easy laughter. With the two young waiters clearing the appetizer plates, he was cold and dismissive without even glancing at their faces. With Penny, he was something harder to name. Attentive in a way that looked like affection from across the room, but felt, up close, more like supervision. Every time I moved toward her during the evening, he appeared beside her within minutes. Then, near the end of the night, his best man, a heavyset man named Phil who had been drinking steadily since the ceremony, leaned close to Brandon and said, loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "Man, if people actually knew how you treat her at home." Brandon's smile didn't move, but his eyes went flat and cold. Phil stopped talking immediately. Something was very wrong here. The reception wound down just after 11. I was collecting my wrap from the coat room when I felt a light touch on my arm. It was Brandon's mother, Constance Hale. She was a slim, well-dressed woman in her 60s who had spent the whole evening looking like she was waiting for something terrible to happen. She leaned close and spoke very quietly. "I owe you an apology, Gloria. What he said tonight was inexcusable. I am deeply sorry." I thanked her and began to say that I appreciated her saying so, when she added something else. Her voice dropped even lower. Her eyes moved quickly toward the door. "You're not the first woman he's spoken to that way, and I'm afraid you won't be the last." She held my gaze for just a moment. Then her husband appeared at her elbow, took her arm firmly, and steered her toward the exit with a brief, expressionless nod in my direction. I stood alone in the coat room doorway, holding my wrap, and turned her words over carefully in my mind all the long drive home. The weeks after the wedding were quiet in a way that felt deliberate. Penny called less. When she did call, the conversations were brief and careful, like someone walking across a floor they weren't sure would hold. I visited 6 weeks after the wedding on a Tuesday afternoon when I knew Brandon would be at work. The house was beautiful, large, well-furnished, everything chosen with obvious care. But it felt the way certain beautiful things feel. Correct on the surface, uncomfortable underneath. Penny made tea. We sat at her kitchen table. She talked about curtains she was thinking of changing and a restaurant they had tried the week before. When I asked gently whether she was happy, She smiled the smile I had watched her practice since she was small, the one designed to end conversations rather than start them. Of course, Mom. Everything is fine. But when I stood to leave and she hugged me at the door, she held on longer than usual. And when she finally stepped back, her hand found mine and squeezed it once tightly. She didn't say anything with her mouth, but I heard her clearly. 3 weeks after my visit, my phone lit up just after midnight with a message from a number I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it. Then I read the first line and sat up straight. Asterisk Mrs. Marsh. You don't know me well, but you may remember me from the wedding. I was Brandon's best man. My name is Phil. I'm sorry for contacting you like this, but I think you deserve to know some things about him. Asterisk. Then a second message. Asterisk, I'm sending you something. It's public record. But I don't think anyone in Penny's family has ever been shown it. Asterisk. The attachment took a moment to open. It was a copy of a restraining order filed 3 years earlier by a woman named in the document as Brandon's previous long-term partner. I read the reason listed for the order twice. Then I set the phone down on the nightstand and lay in the dark for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence of my house, thinking very carefully about what I was going to do next. Phil called me the following evening. He spoke quickly at first, like someone who had rehearsed what he wanted to say and was worried he might lose his nerve before finishing. He had known Brandon for 12 years. Close friends through university. He had watched the pattern repeat across 3 relationships. Public charm so convincing that people meeting Brandon for the first time found it almost impossible to reconcile with what happened privately. In private, Phil said, Brandon humiliated the women he was with. Steadily and methodically. He separated them from their families by making every visit or phone call feel like a small act of disloyalty. He monitored their spending, their friendships, their time. And he never faced consequences. Because his father ran one of the largest private wealth management firms in the state. Because Brandon's name opened every door. Because the people who might have challenged him professionally were also the people whose careers his father's firm could affect. Phil's voice was tired when he finished. I should have said something before the wedding. I know that. I didn't have the courage. But I'm saying it now. I thanked him. Then I sat quietly for a moment and thought about the next step. That night I made myself a promise. I said it out loud in my kitchen, quietly, to no one but myself and the dark window above the sink. I was not going to lose my temper. I was not going to confront Brandon at a family dinner and give him the opportunity to perform innocence in front of an audience. I was not going to call lawyers or make threats or post anything online. I was going to do what I had spent 25 years of my professional life doing. I was going to find the truth, document it properly, and let it speak for itself. Because here was the thing about Brandon Hill. He was arrogant. Genuinely, completely, thoroughly arrogant. And in my experience, arrogant people always leave trails. They don't cover their tracks carefully because it doesn't occur to them that someone capable of following those tracks would ever bother to look. He had looked at me at that wedding and seen a retired woman in a mother-of-the-bride dress. He had no idea what I used to do before I retired. For 25 years before I retired at 60, I worked as a compliance investigator for a national financial regulatory body. My job was not glamorous. I did not carry a badge or make arrests. I sat in small offices and read documents. Thousands of documents. Financial reports, company filings, tax records, transaction histories, charitable foundation disclosures. I looked for the places where numbers didn't quite line up. Where money moved in ways that made sense on paper but not in practice. Where generosity, on closer inspection, turned out to be something else entirely. I had helped build cases that resulted in 8 separate fraud prosecutions over my career. 2 of those had involved men considerably more connected and protected than Brandon Hale. I had retired quietly. No ceremony. No press. I had simply stopped going to the office one Friday and started growing tomatoes in my garden on the Monday. Brandon had called me a pig in front of 200 people. He had not once asked what I used to do for a living. That was his first serious mistake. I started with public records. Business filings connected to Hale Financial Group. Annual reports. Registered subsidiary companies. Charitable organization disclosures submitted to the state. It took me 4 days of careful reading before something caught my eye. Brandon had established a charitable foundation 3 years earlier under his own name, the Brandon Hale Community Foundation. It was registered correctly, filed its reports on time, and presented itself as a model of corporate social responsibility on the firm's website. But the numbers in the filed accounts did not match the claims on the website. The foundation reported receiving substantial donations from the firm each year. The website celebrated the causes it supported with photographs and thank you letters. But when I traced the outgoing payments against the foundation's registered charitable beneficiaries, a significant portion of the inflows had no corresponding charitable destination. The money was going somewhere. It was not going to the charities. I needed more information before I could say where it was going, but I already knew what I was looking at. I had seen it before several times. It always looked exactly like this. I had been working through the foundation records for about a week when someone knocked at my front door on a Wednesday morning. Constance Hale was standing on my porch. She was dressed neatly, but her eyes were tired in a way that suggested she had not been sleeping properly. She held her bag with both hands in front of her, the way people do when they need something to hold on to. I invited her in and made tea. She sat at my kitchen table and was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at me directly and said, "I think Brandon is taking money from the company. From his father's firm. I've suspected it for months. But I don't know how to find out for certain, and I can't bring it to my husband without evidence because he will simply refuse to believe it." She paused. "You were a financial investigator. Penny told me years ago." She looked at her tea. "I don't know who else to ask." I looked at her for a moment. Then I said, "Tell me everything you've noticed." Constance spent 2 hours at my kitchen table. What she described was consistent with what I was already finding in the public records, but her knowledge of the internal operations added detail that the filed documents couldn't provide. She had noticed luxury purchases that didn't match Brandon's declared salary, even a senior director's salary. A second property registered under a company name she didn't recognize. Strange patterns in the firm's client gift account, which Brandon managed, where the approved budget was regularly exceeded without any internal challenge. Her husband, Jeffrey Hale, was 71 and had built the firm over 40 years. He was sharp in many ways and completely blind in one. He could not see his son clearly. He never had been able to. Constance knew that presenting Jeffrey with suspicions would accomplish nothing. He would dismiss them, feel insulted on Brandon's behalf, and become more protective, not less. But presenting Jeffrey with a complete and documented picture, one built carefully enough that he could not find a reason to disbelieve it, was a different matter entirely. "Can you find the full truth?" she asked me. "Yes," I said. "But it will take time and we have to do this properly." She nodded. "However long it takes," she said. We worked carefully over the following weeks. Everything we gathered was from legitimate sources. Public company filings. Charitable organization tax submissions available through the state registry. Property records. Corporate registration documents showing the directors and shareholders of related entities. I had contacts from my working years, former colleagues now in private practice, a forensic accountant I had worked alongside on 2 major investigations who agreed to review what I was finding on a consultancy basis. The picture that emerged was not complicated once you knew what you were looking at. Brandon had set up a chain of 3 small companies registered under variations of family names. The Brandon Hale Community Foundation made regular payments to one of these companies for what the records described as administrative and operational services. That company then transferred funds to the others. From there, the money flowed into accounts that my forensic accountant colleague identified as connected to Brandon's personal investment portfolio. The total amount redirected over 3 years was substantial. We needed one more thing to make the picture complete. We needed someone inside the firm who could confirm what the internal records showed. I thought about the wedding again. Not the toast. The aftermath. Jeffrey Hale at his table, staring at the tablecloth. Not laughing. Not defending his son. Just sitting very still with an expression I had not been able to read at the time. I requested a meeting with him through Constance. She arranged it for a Thursday afternoon at his office. She did not tell him the full reason. She said only that I had some concerns I wanted to raise privately and that she believed he should hear them. He agreed, somewhat reluctantly, to see me for 30 minutes. I arrived with a folder containing 43 pages of documented evidence, every source cited, every figure cross-referenced, my former colleague's written assessment attached at the back. I sat across from Jeffrey Hale in his corner office, and I placed the folder on the desk between us. He looked at the folder. Then he looked at me. "What is this?" he said. "It's the truth about your foundation," I said. "I think you should read it before we discuss anything else." He read for a long time. I sat across from him and looked out the window at the city below and waited. Jeffrey was not a man who showed emotion easily. His face remained composed through the first 20 pages, controlled through the next 10. By the final section, the forensic accountant's summary, his composure had become something different. Not emotion exactly. More like a man sitting very still because standing up would require a response he wasn't ready to give yet. He closed the folder. He sat back in his chair. Outside, the city continued doing what cities do, completely indifferent to what was happening in this particular office on this particular afternoon. Finally, he said, "If this is accurate, and I need to verify that it is, then he hasn't simply embarrassed this family." A long pause. "He's committed fraud against his own family's business." He looked at me directly for the first time since he had started reading. "How long did it take you to build this?" 6 weeks, I said. He was quiet again. Then he said, "Let's find out the full truth. All of it." Jeffrey Hale moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who had spent 40 years making decisions that other people felt the consequences of later. He did not confront Brandon. He did not change his behavior toward him in any visible way. He attended the same Monday morning management meetings, approved the same expense reports, had the same brief conversations in the corridor. But within 72 hours of our meeting, he had engaged an external forensic audit firm, not the company's regular auditors who were too close to the family, to begin a comprehensive review of 3 years of internal financial records. The audit was framed internally as a routine regulatory compliance review. Brandon was told about it in a Monday meeting alongside 15 other senior staff. He showed no particular reaction. When I heard this from Constance, she told me he had bought himself a new sports car that same week. Custom order. He mentioned it to several colleagues. He had no idea the ground was moving under him. The audit took 3 weeks. The external firm was thorough in the way that outside auditors are when they have been specifically briefed on what to look for and given full access to do so. What they found went beyond what I had identified from public records. False vendor invoices submitted through the firm's operational expenses account, approved under Brandon's authority, paid to companies that existed only on paper. Client entertainment expenses charged against the firm's account for events that had never taken place. Internal transfers between subsidiary accounts that had been approved using forged secondary signatures. My forensic accountant had estimated the total redirected amount conservatively. The audit revised that estimate upward considerably. The audit firm delivered their report on a Friday afternoon. Jeffrey read it over the weekend. On Monday morning, he called his legal team. Then he called a board meeting for Wednesday. The only remaining question was my daughter. And that conversation could not wait any longer. I drove to Penny's house on a Tuesday afternoon. I had rehearsed nothing. Preparation would not help here. She opened the door looking surprised to see me on a weekday without a call ahead. I told her I needed to talk to her and that it was important. She made tea automatically, the way she always did, and we sat at her kitchen table. I told her everything in order calmly. The public records. Constance's visit. The forensic accountant. The audit findings. The full picture. At first, she shook her head slowly, the way people do when the brain is protecting itself from information it isn't ready to absorb. Then I opened the folder on the table between us. I watched her read. I watched the expression on her face travel from disbelief through confusion, through something that looked like a door opening slowly in a very dark room. When she finally looked up, her voice was small. "Mom, he's been telling me for months that I'm terrible with money. that I couldn't manage anything on my own, that I was lucky he handled everything. She stopped. He's been doing this the whole time? I reached across and held her hand. Yes, I said. But it's over now. The four of us, Jeffrey, Constance, my legal contact who had helped structure the documentation, and I spent 2 evenings planning how to proceed. The approach was deliberate and careful. No confrontation in private. No warning given in advance. No opportunity for Brandon to prepare a response, or begin moving assets, or constructing an explanation. Jeffrey scheduled a full board meeting for Wednesday at 10 in the morning. The firm's 6 senior directors, plus 3 non-executive board members would attend. Brandon was included on the invitation list as he normally would be for a board meeting of this type. The agenda listed it as a quarterly business review with a presentation on the Foundation's community program for the coming year. Brandon was specifically asked to lead the Foundation section. He confirmed his attendance without asking any questions. The auditors would be present. Their report would be presented immediately after Brandon finished his opening remarks. Jeffrey told me the evening before that he had not slept well. Neither have I told him. Do you think he'll try to deny it? He asked. Men like Brandon always do, I said. Right up until the moment they can't. I was not in the boardroom. That had never been part of the plan, and I had not wanted it to be. This was not my stage. I had done what I was trained to do, found the evidence, organized it properly, handed it to the people with the authority to act on it. What happened inside that room was Jeffrey's to manage. Constance called me just after 11. She spoke quietly. She told me that Brandon had presented the Foundation program with considerable confidence. New initiatives. Projected charitable impact for the coming year. He had used the word generosity 4 times. Then Jeffrey had asked him to pause. And Jeffrey had invited the lead auditor to speak. Constance said that as the auditor began walking through the first set of transactions, methodical, documented, sourced, Brandon had looked around the table. Once. Twice. Then he tried to laugh. He said there must be a misunderstanding. He said the accounts were complex and clearly the auditors lacked context. Nobody in the room laughed. Nobody spoke. They simply watched the auditor continue reading from the report. I heard the full account of what followed from Constance and later from Jeffrey himself. The auditor presented for 40 minutes. Transaction by transaction. Each one sourced to a specific date, a specific account, a specific approval. Each fake vendor listed with the registration details of the shell companies. Each forged signature identified and compared against originals in the company's own records. Brandon interrupted 3 times in the first 15 minutes. The auditor paused politely each time, acknowledged the interjection, and then continued from where he had left off. By the halfway point of the presentation, Brandon had stopped interrupting. By the final section, a clear summary chart showing the full amount redirected over 3 years, he had stopped looking at the table around him and was staring at the surface in front of him instead. The auditor finished and stepped back. The room was completely silent. Jeffrey looked at his son for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice that Constance described to me later as very quiet and very final, I trusted you with everything I built. And this is what you did with it. Jeffrey stood up. He addressed the board directly. His voice was steady. The voice of a man who had made 40 years of difficult decisions and understood that this one, whatever it cost him personally, could not be avoided. He announced that Brandon Hale was suspended from all roles and responsibilities within Hale Financial Group with immediate effect, pending a full legal investigation into the audit findings. He thanked the auditors. He asked the legal representatives to begin the necessary procedures. Then he looked at his son one last time and said, "You should call your lawyer." Brandon pushed his chair back. He stood up. He looked around the room once more, perhaps hoping for something. A friendly face, a note of doubt, someone who might suggest this had all been a misunderstanding. The board members looked at their documents, or at Jeffrey, or at the wall. Not one of them looked at Brandon. He walked out of the boardroom without saying anything else. The door closed behind him. Penny called me that evening. She had already spoken to a solicitor. She had made that appointment 3 days earlier, quietly on her own. She told me this, and I felt something ease in my chest that I hadn't realized I had been holding tight. She was filing for legal separation. Her voice on the phone was different from how it had sounded in recent months. Steadier. Cleaner. Like a room after the windows have been opened. She said, I kept thinking I was making it up. That I was being too sensitive. He was so good at making me feel like anything I noticed was my own problem. I listened. Every time I thought about calling you, I talked myself out of it. I thought you'd be worried. Or I thought he'd find out and it would make things worse. I know, I said. I should have called. You're calling now, I said. That's enough. She didn't apologize again. I was glad of that. She was done apologizing for things that were not her fault. 4 months after the board meeting, there was a preliminary legal hearing connected to the fraud investigation. I was not involved in the proceedings. I had submitted my documentation formally through the appropriate channels earlier in the process, and my forensic accountant colleague had provided an expert statement. My part in the evidentiary chain was complete. But I had an errand near the courthouse that morning, and the timing meant I was walking along the pavement outside as people were moving in and out of the building. I saw Brandon across the street. He was with 2 lawyers walking quickly, head down. He looked smaller than I remembered from the wedding. Not physically. Something else. The quality that had filled a room, that easy, careless certainty, was gone from the way he carried himself. He looked up as I was passing. Our eyes met across the street. For a moment neither of us moved. Then he looked away, down at the pavement. Quickly and completely, the way people look away from something that makes them feel ashamed. I continued walking. I did not slow down. I did not smile. I simply walked on past in the autumn morning and did not look back. A year after the wedding, Penny moved into a flat 12 minutes from my house. She had found a new position at an architectural firm. She had always been good at design, but Brandon had spent 2 years quietly discouraging her from pursuing it properly. She went back to it without fanfare and turned out to be exactly as good at it as she had always been. She came for dinner on a Sunday evening in November. We cooked together and ate at the kitchen table and talked about ordinary things, her new colleagues, a plant she was trying to keep alive on her windowsill, a film she wanted us to see together. After dinner, she was washing up and I was drying, and she said without turning around, Mom, why didn't you go at him at the wedding? You could have. Anyone would have. I thought about it for a moment. Because if I had shouted at him that night, I would have given him exactly what men like him are built for, I said. He knows how to handle a scene. He's been performing in scenes his whole life. I set down the plate I was drying. What he didn't know how to handle was someone who just watched and waited and did the work. Penny turned around and looked at me. He called you a pig, she said. In front of everyone. I know, I said. And he ended up losing his job, his marriage, and his reputation. Yes, I said. He did all of that himself. I just helped make sure nobody could look away. She was quiet for a moment. Then she laughed. A real laugh, the unguarded kind I hadn't heard from her in far too long. And standing in my kitchen on that quiet Sunday evening, drying dishes with my daughter while the street outside went dark and still, I felt something I had not expected to feel quite so fully. Gratitude. Not for what had happened. Not for the pain any of us had carried through it. But for the truth. For the way it had finally, after so long, been allowed to be exactly what it was.